a semi-abstract atmospheric style. So let's get started. Just to say, a list of all the materials I'm going to be using in this tutorial will be in the description below, and to get there just click on show more on the left just below the short description. Depending on what device you're using, sometimes there's a little down arrow just to the right of the title. Just click on that and it will take you to the description. I hope this is helpful, and if you have any problems just drop me a line in the comment section. Here are some of the materials that I'm going to be using in this step-by-step tutorial. So they're not your traditional sort of watercolour materials. There's the palette knife, I've got my plastic card, I've got my spritzer bottle and my pipette. So I'm going to create lots of yummy textures. I'm going to be using some cling film to create the foreground grasses, and I really love using it to get some lovely exciting textures. I'm going to be using cadmium yellow and quinacridone gold. If you don't have these, use any yellow, and you could use raw sienna or yellow ochre. I'm using ultramarine, and if you don't have that, you could use cobalt blue. And I'm using quinacridone rose from M. Graham, but if you don't have that, permanent rose, opera rose, even alizarin crimson will be absolutely fine. Also using Daniel Smith's Cascade green and green Apatite genuine. I just love these colours. I'm almost running out, so I must order some more. But if you don't have these, any green will do. Sap green, hooker's green, viridian. Just mix it up and use those greens. Lastly, I'm using sepia because it's a lovely dark brown, but if you don't have that, you could use burnt umber. Okay, now for the palette knives, I've got one plastic one here and I've got a metal one here, but anything will do. And if you don't have them, you can always stick to the plastic card, and I'm using a wooden peg that you get at the back of box canvas paintings. If you don't have that, you could always use your twig. The brushes that I'm using are the Black Velvet series by Silver Brush, size 14 and size 4. I've been using them a lot in my recent videos. I'm still enjoying them. I'm still finding them really fabulous. I love the points and their holding capacity. I'm also going to be using my Spritzer bottle by Derwent. I've had this a long time, and a pipette just to drop some water onto the painting. I'm also using a large mop brush as well, but you can use any large brush that you have to hand. Also got my water pot and this disposable food tray to use for my colour mixing instead of my usual palette. I'm using Winsor Newton's Hot Pressed 300 gram paper, and it's 14 by 10, and I put some of the framing tape around the edge because I really like to have a nice white border at the finish of each painting. It is a gummed block pad, so it can help prevent buckling of the paper, but not all the time, especially if you work really wet in wet. Just to say the different surfaces of watercolour paper, I'm using hot press, which is paper is hot press, which is a smooth paper, but you could use a cold press paper as well, which has got a little bit of texture. Actually squeezing out now my ultramarine and my quinacridone rose. I'm mixing them sort of together. I've got the pink on its own and I'm touching in the blue, so you've got a sort of a mixture of colours, so it's not all one flat colour, so you get a nice sort of variable colours on your painting, which can be quite exciting. Just using my little salt container to put the painting at a little angle so that when I paint the sky, it kind of runs down a little. I've just squeezed out a little bit of the green, and I've decided to draw the sort of basic composition with my twig. It is an ordinary twig straight from the garden, and you can sharpen it with a pencil sharpener, dip it into paint, and it actually adds, it's like a pencil, and it's really nice to draw with. It just feels very authentic in the hand. So I'm just drawing the outline now of this mountain. You have to keep dipping your twig into your paint to get more fresh paint, but it creates a nice sort of line, doesn't it? Just sort of bringing the paint. I like it, and you can soften that edge as well, so it's not, you don't have to rub it out like you do with pencil afterwards. So I quite like this technique. As you can see, I'm just wetting the sky area now with my size 14 brush. Plenty of water on there so I can paint the sky wet in wet. So I'm loading my size 14 brush, really getting lots of paint on there. And as you can see, a nice free flowing brush mark going across the paper, and because there's a slight tilt you can see the paint running down. There's now a little bit more of a bluey violet going on there, and I'm giving the brush a good rinse because I want to dilute the paint a little bit so it looks lighter as it goes behind those mountains, and I'm pushing up that water so I can get the light behind the mountain. Adding a little bit more pink now on the left hand side, painting wet in wet still. I've decided to give it a little tilt and just get the paint moving a little bit. It's quite warm in the studio, so I just want to get this paint moving so that it blends more. I'm now putting a slightly creamier ultramarine touch of rose into the sky at the top just to create a little bit more tonal value there. I'm using the size 4 brush now just so it doesn't put too much paint on, so I'm kind of painting damp into wet. I'm now using my large size 14 brush and I'm painting the middle distance and the foreground. This is the field area of the painting. There's kind of 3 zones in this painting: the sky, the mountains and the fields. So I'm giving it a good soak with my brush, making sure it's really wet because it's quite a large area. Now, if you want to, you could mix up your washes first in advance, but I quite like to paint as I go because I always keep changing my mind, but I always like to work light to dark with colours. So I'm using the cadmium yellow first and just dropping that colour in. It's quite a creamy colour. The surface of the painting is very wet. If you notice how I do my brush strokes, I really try to paint sort of quite nice broad brush strokes, not holding the brush tightly right up my nose up against the paper. Really try to be as flamboyant as you can in your brush stroke, especially when you're painting large areas like this. You can be really creative and really sort of loose and free with the paint. So I'm just giving it a little tilt here because you can see the little run going up into the sky. Now, if you're worried about painting and getting paint in the sky, give that a blow dry first before you paint your middle distance and your foreground. So I've creamed up the Quinacridone gold now and I'm just dropping that in as well. And it's a really lovely, vibrant colour, this Quinacridone gold by M. Graham. But there are other brands as well that are equally as good. So I'm just painting this on here now, just in sort of patches here and there, because of course I want my lemon yellow to show through as well, so the colours are sort of blending as well on the paper. Now I'm using this green Apatite Genuine from Daniel Smith, which I absolutely adore because it creates this amazing texture, and you'll see that evolve in a few minutes. But I'm using the size 14 brush and just sweeping this paint on, being quite generous. It's quite creamy, but the brush is very heavily loaded with paint as well, and as you can see the paper is quite wet, so it's a lovely damp into wet technique that I'm doing here with lovely broad strokes. So don't be afraid of it, or try not to be afraid of it. If the worst happens, all you have to do in this area is just to put it under the tap and wash it all off, and don't let the water touch your sky. So just enjoy yourselves. So I'm just mixing up a lovely thicker, darker green now because the surface of the paper now is more damp than wet. So I want to make sure that my paint is the same sort of consistency. I've added a little touch more ultramarine in there into the Cascade green and ultramarine, and just painting now smaller marks, damp into damp here and there, and I've decided now to tilt it to the side and use my spritzer bottle to get this paint moving, because the whole idea of this demonstration is to create lots of lovely techniques, lots of textures. It's not your conventional way of watercolour painting, but it is exciting and it's very creative. So just keep tilting. Don't be afraid to tilt for ages to get your desired effect. I'm also using the pipette just because I quite like the little watermarks it has as well. But also if things are drying off in areas, you can re-wet them with the pipette as well. But you may get the odd background because obviously you're introducing a wet wash into drying paint. But I don't know if you can see that there in the middle of that green, you can see that green Apatite Genuine. The texture that's created there is stunning. The little yellow into the green there, just to make a slightly lighter green for the distance there, not as strong. This is all damp into damp work with a size 4 brush, just to create more marks and more texture and more fun. So I'm using my larger brush again now, and I'm going to make a really dark colour, and I'm using the Sepia with some ultramarine, with obviously some of the green left behind there and even a little bit of pink. So it's an extremely dark colour, but if in doubt, just use the ultramarine and the Sepia. And I'm just dropping this in now. It's quite creamy, damp into damp, just putting large brush strokes of colour. Don't be scared about doing this because I'm going to put the cling film on, and I need darks with the cling film because otherwise it's going to look far too pale. So now's the time to have lots of fun. And as you can see, I've fully loaded that size 14 brush with lots and lots of paint, and I'm drizzling in this watercolour. It is just gorgeous and it feels good to do. It's almost like art therapy, this. I'm absolutely love watching it back, but I loved painting it as well. Just before I put the cling film on, I thought I'd just do a little bit more tilting. I do love to tilt. I love to get the paint moving to see if there's going to be some happy accidents, and then I'll get my spray bottle and try and get some things moving and wipe off any excess with my J-cloth or a kitchen towel. I'm now using the cling film, and I've got a nice large piece to fit on this area here, and I've made the top bit sort of thinner and the bottom bit a bit wider so it gives it a bit of distance. So I've just sort of used the tips of my fingers to press it down and to get sort of different marks, and I'm just going to leave it there to dry now. Isn't quite dry, but it is set. So if you're a bit impatient like me, you can peel it off, but if it starts to run back on itself, wait a bit longer. But it seems to have set here, but it's still a little bit damp, so I am going to blow dry it. But isn't that gorgeous? It's so effective, cling film. You can sort of do so many things with it. So I'm just giving this a quick blow dry now, and now you see my painting has dried and it really does look quite effective. So now I'm going to wet my mountains with my large size 14 brush. I'm just going to take my time, nice clean water, and wet the mountains. Once you finish wetting your mountain area, use your metal palette knife or your plastic card even, and mix up some creamy ultramarine with the Quinacridone rose and paint this damp into wet onto the mountain area with your palette knife. And look at that stunning colour. I'm just painting it at the top and the top edges. I'm now using the Cascade green straight from the tube, that it was a bit dry, so I'm actually now wetting that area again, and it's kind of like a happy accident because it's kind of created these lovely textures, and I'm using the brush to manipulate and get things going. I'm using this size 14 brush, the tip of it, and I'm just sort of painting along, just moving that ultramarine, getting it to drizzle into the Cascade green, but also to sort of run down into the lighter area of the mountain because the watercolour paper is on a tilt. So I've decided to put a little bit more of the ultramarine with the rose on the left hand side here, just to balance out everything. It's got a little bit of Cascade green in there as well. It's such fun to paint with these palette knives. You can feel really sort of different, really, almost fearless when you're putting it on, whereas sometimes with a brush it kind of tightens you up. It's the opposite using a palette knife. So I'm just popping on a little bit of the cadmium yellow now as well, and you can see it's made a touch of green because obviously the blue and the yellow make green, but it's all quite exciting. And now I've decided, because it's a bit dry, that I've just decided to use my pipette to water it down and now to do some tilting. And I find when you tilt like this you get some really interesting marks. I want to create sort of natural sort of marks that you would get in nature. I've decided to use my Spritzer bottle just to get things moving. It was sort of sitting up there and it wasn't moving enough for me. The thing is, you've almost got to be less is more here. Yes, I'm spraying it, but don't overspray because you're going to literally lose your whole mountain doing that. So just little short bursts should do the trick. I felt my mountain peak was a little bit flat and even, so I'm just raising it on the left hand side. I'm just doing it with my size 4 brush. It's damp, I'm not putting any paint on it. I just want to move the paint that's there, that's damp anyway, just to move it a little bit to the left, a little bit higher. I'm using that size 4 brush now just to drop in a little bit of that Cascade green with a touch of yellow, and now I've added a touch of blue as well. At this moment in time, I'm just experimenting. I'm not quite sure where to go with this, and sometimes that happens in painting. You're not quite sure, but it's just sort of putting things on and then trying things out, and if it doesn't look good, as you can see what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to spray it off, because I'm kind of painting from my imagination, experimenting, creating something that's semi-abstract. I'm not copying this painting, so it's almost harder in a way to do something abstract, but it is so much more fun and it feels very therapeutic to paint in this style. So I'm just using a plastic card. I've got some thick, creamy, dark paint, the sepia, the rose, the ultramarine. I mean, you can see I'm just scraping everything in the palette there. So it's just putting this on, and this is quite damp. This is quite thick, creamy paint, and it's onto a wet surface because obviously I've just sprayed off earlier. I just want to see if I can get something going, something exciting here, putting on those darts. Now I'm using the pipette to see if I can get some more textures. That's the whole thing in this style of painting. You're not sure what you're going to get, and sometimes you can get some real magic. So I'm continuing on in this experimental style. I'm using the palette knife and I've actually squeezed the paint onto the surface, and I've just used my size 4 brush just to dilute it a little, and I'm painting this on just to see what happens. But I'm not quite sure about that. You just don't know. And again, it's an experiment, and I'm just going to soften and spray off. Now, this is a bit of a blooper. It wasn't in the public video, so there we are. You've seen behind the scenes, as it were. So I'm using the plastic palette knife now, and I'm just painting this really thick, creamy sepia paint with a touch of blue, and I'm just putting on some dark marks on the edges of this mountain here and there. And remember, the surface is still quite damp, so I don't want it to bleed too much. I just want to put a few dark accents. And again, I feel like I'm sort of in a comfortable area here, but I've now put on some more paint, which I'm not sure about. With these membership extended videos, you really do get to see all the process. You know, not all the perfect painting, but actually things where I've had to rectify and smooth over and sort of problem solve, really. And I hope this is helping you, because you can problem solve and sort things out in watercolour painting. And what's happened there on the left hand side of the mountain is it's softer now, and I actually really like it. By spraying it and softening it, it's actually created mist and atmosphere. Don't be hard on yourself. Your mistakes could turn out to be the best thing in your painting. So now I'm using this wooden peg, and I'm going to paint the trees with this, which is going to be fun. Instead of using a brush to mix, I'm actually using the wooden peg, and I've used some of the green, a touch of pink, just to really make a lovely dark green colour. And as you can see, it's going on, it's wet on dry, and it creates a little bit of texture for for all these trees in the distance. And you can sort of vary the colour mix. I mean, my palette, as you can see, my little silver tray there, has got very sort of mucky, but in a way I love this because all the colours are all sort of beside each other, and you can just dip here, and it creates a lot of colour harmony. So I'm just getting the paint on quite creamy and just basically drawing it on. What I'm doing now is I'm using my size 4 brush. It's a little bit wet, and I'm just using that brush to dilute some of that paint so I can create some lighter areas within the trees. And what I'm doing here in a way is I'm working dark to light, which is the opposite to what we usually do in watercolour painting, which is quite fun. I'm also dropping in some very dark ultramarine with the Cascade green here to put some dark at the bottom of the trees, and just softening as I go. If you've watched any of my other YouTube videos, you know I like to use the cadmium yellow or the lemon yellow to create more light. And you can do this in watercolour. That's such a good pigmented colour. And I'm just putting on a little bit of light on the trees here, and then I'm softening. Because sometimes when things go a little bit dark, you can use the yellows to create more light. I do hope you're sitting down for this one. I'm using my very large size 14 brush. I've mixed up some blue and brown. Going to paint a great big shadow here, so don't be scared. I'm just sweeping it across the paper. I've diluted my brush to soften that paint and to blend, so don't be scared. We need shadows to make our lights look fabulous. What I'm doing now is I'm rinsing my brush, taking the excess water off at the side and going back into the shadow colour so you can get that lovely soft edge. That's a really nice technique. Mixed up some more dark. That's the blue and the green and a touch of brown, and I'm painting this wet on dry. Left little gaps in between so there's light coming through those grasses as well. So I'm sweeping this colour. This brush just glides across this hot press paper. The thing you don't want to do is put too much opaque thick paint on, because you want to still see those lovely cling film marks that you made earlier. So you want the darks to be quite dilute, so in a way that should be less scary. So I'm just mixing up some more paint here, the blue and the green, and sweeping it on the right hand side here. Don't be afraid to use lovely large brush marks, and be expressive in those brush marks as well. It's really fun to do. So I'm just again softening with a soft clean brush just to get those lovely soft edges. I'm just swapping now to the size 4 brush because I want to make smaller marks in the distance so it creates more depth. Large marks in the foreground bring things forward, smaller marks throw things back. I'm going to do exactly the same technique. I'm putting on these darks, not as strong, but then I'm just going to soften as I did in the foreground with a damp, clean brush, or as clean as my water pot looks. Doesn't look that clean, but just using the same technique. It's a nice way, it's a great way of just blending edges for watercolour painting. So I'm just putting a little bit of dark here on the left hand side. It's really just to counterbalance the right hand side, just because it looked a little bit sort of right side dominant, and it's just a dark green. I'm using the plastic card to put a few little grasses in. I'm also putting a few darks now in these distant trees to finish off this painting. So I'm just giving my brush a rinse now, and I'm just going to soften those darks so it doesn't stand out too much. So I'm just going to spatter the foreground. I've decided to use that lovely cadmium yellow and just to spatter some wild yellow flowers to the right and the left hand side of the painting. The paint is creamy, but it's not too watery, because if it is, it will dry and you won't really see the yellow at all. Remember to use some kitchen towel to cover your sky and your mountain. The last thing you want to do is try and get the yellow dots out of your sky. So I'm going to take off the framing tape now. I want to have a good look at this painting with the white border, because it will make me more objective and to see if I need to paint anymore. If the framing tape tears your paper or your masking tape, use a hairdryer on the tape beforehand. It softens the glue and it comes off easier. I hope that little tip helps. So I'm now having a look at the painting. I'm really pleased with it. I love this white border. However, I still felt it was right side dominant. Maybe it's just me. So I decided just to put a few more trees to the left hand side. If you look at the reference photo, there are some little buildings there. I didn't want to start fiddling around with buildings. I just thought I'd keep it really simple and just put some more of those trees to balance out and finish the painting. As you can see, I use the same colours and techniques that I did on the right hand side using my size 4 brush. I didn't actually include this in the public video, so you're getting a little extra here. I'm just softening now the right hand side just to finish off with a little cadmium yellow here and there. But I think I'll leave it before I overwork it. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and learned all the lovely techniques that you can do with the cling film and the palette knife and the spraying, and just being creative and experimental and having fun and just trying new things out. Art can be very therapeutic. Don't be hard on yourself, just enjoy it. It's just a piece of paper. It's all about the practice and the going forward. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments section below this video and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.